Thank you very much, comrades. It's very difficult to sing on the visual because we are at various points. It's very difficult to synchronize the singing. And therefore, what we have done, we've tried our best, and thank you very much, comrades. We will be starting with our program. The General Secretary, Comrade Blade, the first DGS, Comrade Soli, and all other officials that will be joining us today. The PB, the Central Committee, all the provincial leaders, districts and branches, and all other comrades who have joined us today. I need to indicate that today, comrades, it is a historical day where we are having our conference, the party conference of the Commissars for Women on a visual platform. It's a rare occasion, it's just new. We're actually now joining this industrial, the fourth IR. I want to greet all of you. This is under the theme, comrades, learning from the past, active in the present, building the future, building socialism. The banner here still indicates as we're celebrating our 99th anniversary. You are all welcome, and a revolutionary greeting to all of you. We meet here today on an August month that is dedicated to the contribution, the celebration, the recognition of the historic struggles and victories won by brave women against all forms of oppression, and again against patriarchy that is taking a lead and that is being so stubborn up till to this day. This month, comrades, informed by our 9th of August, which is the National Women's Day, has seen a lot of celebration taking place in the country and even internationally, where our comrades are, with this knowledge that it was a hard-won victory. It is historic in many ways, even here in the Communist Party, for the women who contributed and played a very special role and did so many good work that we can talk about. We celebrate prominent women who led, and some are still leading this party as we talk about, some of them having their birthdays during this current month, like Comrade Gertrude Chope, who has her 95th birthday, which was celebrated. We have also Comrade Rika Hudson, whom we celebrated at Jack Simon Party School as the party over this weekend, held in her memory as she would be 100 years with the theme of Red Card Against Racism. Comrades will remember we had also Comrade Ray Alexander, who contributed to the penning down of a woman's charter, amongst others. Comrade Lillian Ngoyi, who was in the forefront to launch the FEDSO, which is the Federation of South African Women. The comrades like Dora Tamana, who stamped the concept of cooperatives and self-help centers for women, and many more women that I can mention. And I must say, we are so glad today we are joined also by our prominent women in the party, like Comrade Geraldine, Comrade Tenjiwe, whom we know that have played a very key role in terms of motivating and also contributing to the struggle against gender oppression. We sincerely appreciate that. I would also like to welcome the ambassador for Cuba, who's part of this program and who will be participating. Comrades, we are all welcome. I would request all of us to just observe a moment of silence. We unfortunately lost so many of our comrades during this current COVID time. And just last week, we were burying Comrade JK, Comrade John Ngadime. And yesterday, we just heard that Comrade Dambuza from Limpopo has lost us. Can I request that we observe a moment of silence in mourning? Thank you very much. Amandla. Now, comrades, I am going to take you through the program for today quite briefly before I actually call our comrades, the GS of the party, Dr. Nzimande, to give us a keynote address. But let me indicate how our program is going to be standing for today. I will be assisted by Comrade Bulelwa, who will immediately facilitate after me. Comrade Koliswa will also assist with the facilitation, while we will then do the conclusion at the end. So we have divided this into 4 sessions, which is now we have even begun with the first session. So what is going to happen now after Comrade Blade has made a keynote address, we are going to call for international solidarity from the ambassador of Palestine on women in Palestine and women in diplomacy. I actually said Cuba, I wanted to say Palestine earlier on. After that, Comrade Bulelwa will facilitate, where there will be a panel that will be including Comrade Geraldine Fraser-Mulekedi, who will be talking on gender equality in the family and the community and how we resolve the social production crisis. Comrade Pedhorn, organizing women, workers in the public sector, private sector, and informal economy for building a social future. That will be followed by a discussion where we actually discuss the inputs of the participants. We will then have responses from the panelists thereafter and move on to facilitation by Comrade Koliswa Fihlani. There will be inputs from CADA's Development Women's Party members. That input will be led by Comrade Jenny Schreiner. There will be also a discussion thereafter on that matter of CADA development and program for women. The last session that I will facilitate will pen for us a way forward from this important conference. And then that will be led by Comrade First Deputy General Secretary, Comrade Mapaila, and we'll be looking towards a gender SACP implementation plan, which is very important that you are seated here today to actually come up with a path that will lead going forward. Comrades, thank you very much for all of you ensuring that we make this a historical entrance of our important conference. I am going without a waste of time and move on to the General Secretary, Comrade Blade. Over to you. Ordinarily, we would be singing, a very powerful song. Unfortunately, it's not possible. So we're just going to hand over the platform to you, Comrade Blade.
Comrade Joyce, it looks like the GS has temporarily lost connection.
Can I request Comrade Mshawa to be looking into that aspect in the meantime, while we will be looking also on other key matters that will form part of the program?
It's coming back. Yeah.
He is back.
He is in the process of coming back.
Okay. Comrades, we will just await the General Secretary to rejoin us, give him a bit of space to breathe and take us through the keynote address.
I'm back, Chair.
We are sorry about that, Comrade Blade. We are actually handing over to you now to give us a keynote address.
Thank you very much, Comrade Joyce. The only way to explain what has happened to me, I didn't look at my battery and I hadn't connected to electricity, so my laptop collapsed. Now, the easiest way to explain this is that men can't multitask. That's a simple thing that I learned having grown up in a woman-headed household, by the way. My mother would not have done such a silly, because I can't concentrate on preparing for my speech, listening to you, and making sure that my battery is connected. Comrades, thank you very much. Let me start by greeting you, Chair, our first Deputy General Secretary, Comrade Sholi, and other officials who may have joined us by now, and all the members of the Central Committee who are participating in this meeting. Of course, I must also recognize our long-standing cadres who we are very pleased they are joining us today. Comrade Tenji from Madrid, all the way, and Comrade Geraldine Fraser Mlegate. Comrades, we really appreciate this. The Cuban ambassador, Comrade Ambassador, thank you very much for being part of us. But let me greet all the comrades who are participating in this. Some as members of the party, but others also participating from our allies, something that is very important. Comrades, we resolved some years back that we are going to actually convene a conference of women commissars annually as the SACP. That's a while back. I think it's more than a decade ago, if I'm not mistaken, with the aim of using this as part of the SACP's cadre development to advance political education and ideological training, with a particular focus on women cadres, and deliberately so. Given the centrality of women's struggles in the totality of our own struggles, and of course, to strengthen women inside the SACP, given the fact that for a long time, by the way, our record of producing women leaders, amongst other things at different levels, leaves a lot to be desired. For instance, as things stand now, there is not a single woman provincial secretary. Even if you look at national level, the women in the Central Committee, although we don't narrowly as the party do bin counting, but that's very important to say. Even at district level, if I'm not mistaken, there are not more than 2 women district secretaries. Comrade Sori can be able to tell us about that. Of over 60 district secretaries that we actually had. So that was partly what informed this focus by the party, decided by the Central Committee some years back, to actually consciously develop a women's commissariat. Of course, a women's commissariat is not just going to specialize on focusing on other women, but women commissariat are party cadres who must operate in all the spheres and sites of struggle that the party is involved in. Now, secondly, this matter of an annual conference of women's commissars, this important program, was also part of building the SACP deliberately as a large vanguard party. Something that I'm just going to explain briefly, because I think it's very important to remind ourselves what we meant by this. Building an SACP as a large vanguard party of the working class, capable of deepening and defending the national democratic revolution and advancing the struggle towards a socialist South Africa. Now, let me then just clarify, because it's important we remind ourselves of this, because we haven't met in this form for quite some time. The reference to a large vanguard party in our program, the South African Road to Socialism, meant that the Conference of Women Commissars is part of building the SACP as a vanguard party. We can't be a truly genuine vanguard party without significant women's participation in the life of the party in all its programs and at all its levels. Our party program does distinguish between a large vanguard party and a mass party. We're quite conscious about that a vanguard party is a party that must be cadre-based rather than just membership-based in terms of numbers, which is what a mass party would be. So we are not talking about numbers for their own sake, but we are talking about quality. Of course, we are not under any illusion, comrades. The fact that we have grown the party now from not more than 3,000 members in 1990 to more than 300,000 members now has posed huge challenges for us. That numbers do bring about problems, and also they do affect quality, worsened by the fact that our resource base is very small, including financial resources, which are very important. But also at the same time, the kind of party we are building is the party of the 21st century, is the SACP of the 21st century. For instance, the SACP cannot organize in the same way as the International Socialist League, for instance, between 1915 and 1921. Important as that form of organizing was, and also, of course, it was relevant for its time. Also, we can't organize the SACP today as if it is the CPSA prior to 1950. There is a marked difference between the conditions of the 20th century and 21st century. Between January 1950, when our party was outlawed, and 2nd of February 1990, for example, the SACP had to organize in the underground, in exile, in the international sphere, and also actively participating in the armed struggle. In other words, the party was fully participating in the 4 pillars of our struggle between 1960 and 1990. This was an important strategy of an SACP of the 20th century in response to the repression of the apartheid regime.
Sorry, AGS, requires the comrades to mute. The background is actually disturbing the speech. Please, comrades, just check mute, and all those that enters, they must enter muted.
That is why sometimes comrades get irritated. We don't take kindly for things to be thrown at us that we are no longer the party of Moses Kotane. Of course, one way of arguing that is to say, yes, we can't be a party of Moses Kotane because we are in the 21st century. Yet we are pursuing the very same objectives that Kotane was pursuing. If Kotane were to wake up today and find a communist party that's similar to the one he knew in 1968, he would scold us and say, where have you been sleeping? You died with me, you know? So we must move with the times, because the post-1994 period posed new challenges, the democratic breakthrough, and also created new imperatives and new organizing conditions. It was no longer necessary to be operating in exile or in an armed struggle, or underground for that matter. We had dislodged the apartheid regime, and the ANC had ascended to the legislative and executive arms of the state through democratic election, also gaining access to other levers of state power. And in that process also, SACP cadres actively participated in government, as they still do today, within the framework of an ANC-led government. And of course, we continued with some of the work we had done before, like our internationalist work and mass organization, albeit under vastly different conditions. So we had to shift. the way we do things. But we remain a vanguard party, but a vanguard party relevant to its times. For instance, Lenin reminds us in What is to be Done that a vanguard party means a party of professional revolutionaries. What Marx and Engels in the manifesto referred to as the most advanced and resolute section of the working class of every country, the communists. But what we must know is that, as Lenin said, one does not become a vanguard cadre or party merely by having people completing membership forms or by declaring ourselves as such. To build itself to become a vanguard party, the Communist Party needs to recruit and produce vanguard cadres, professional revolutionaries, members who are the most advanced and resolute. Then this, comrades may worry, why are we emphasizing this? We're reminding ourselves because, just to underline that, the establishment of the Conference of the Women Commissariat is part of this strategy to produce professional revolutionaries amongst our women and the most advanced and resolute of the working class of our country. Now, the other thing that is important, because of the type of event and activity we are in, is that the SACP never, ever trains exclusively for itself. I think it's very important that comrades understand this, simply because the cadres of the party are drawn from various formations and sites of struggle, whether in the trade unions, in the informal sector, youth formations, government officials, etc. Therefore, as we train these women party cadres, we are also training for cadres operating in other spheres of struggle. Some comrades do not understand this. You hear today comrades saying, yeah, why should we prioritize building the trade union movement instead of prioritizing building the SACP? We do both at all times. That is the character of a vanguard party and the history of this SACP. If you want to know, the SACP of Moses Kotane, that's the legacy that it has left, which still remains very important. Now, having highlighted then the importance of building the SACP as a vanguard party, let me just try and reflect very quickly, comrades, on some of the key challenges that face us, because it's important that we don't just do some kind of nice theoretical discussions. I see the program, fortunately, is not doing that. But we are also tackling, because we must build women cadres on the basis of concrete struggles today going forward. We are meeting in the midst and at the height of COVID-19, though there is some light at the end of the tunnel that we may be plateauing now and hopefully beginning to go down, whilst we must remain vigilant in terms of this virus. But it's also very important, I was talking to Comrade Jenny the other day, that Comrade Jenny, I would really still like the party to convene, it's easier these days, a webinar on COVID-19 and women. Because a part of developing a commissariat, we must understand now, for example, in my government work, we asked the HSRC to do a survey for us on the impact of COVID-19, especially in the townships and the villages, in selected areas. We selected Khayelitsha, we selected Diepsloot in Gauteng, we selected, I can't remember now, eThekwini, but one of these meager informal settlements and a couple of townships. It was very interesting, for instance, to look at where ordinary working class women are spending their money and where ordinary working class men are spending their own meager resources. What were women spending their money on? Paying for electricity, for food, for school uniforms. Now, in the midst of COVID-19, even when the schools were closed, where were the men spending their money? In the bottle stores, when the bottle stores were on and off open during the lockdown, in travel, and many other things. What this tells us actually is what the party has been saying, that the women are at the heart of social reproduction and dealing with that, the many crises of social reproductions and the battles of maintaining households. I hope that this women's conference will begin to reflect on this. Now, we are having COVID-19 at the time when our economy was facing one of its worst crises. In fact, COVID-19 has exposed us further in terms of the levels of inequality in our country. We have said, as the Central Committee reflecting on COVID-19, that whilst we still face what we call the triple structural challenges, if one were to describe them correctly, of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, we are now faced with new but immediate triple crises of COVID-19, a deepening economic crisis as the second one, and thirdly, the multiple crises of social reproduction. Retrenchments are increasing at the moment. There's gonna be sharp rise, already it's happening, in unemployment. But at the same time, we are fighting other battles inside the state and outside in the alliance. Again, of an attempt to impose a neoliberal policy regime of solutions that are the IMF, your OECD, and monopoly finance capital are wanting to impose on us. So as we meet, we then want to say, if we have got these three immediate crises we have to deal with, COVID-19, the deepening economic crisis and multiple crises of social reproduction, where are the women? But also we mustn't ask that question and end there, as if women are merely victims. How do we organize women in the context of all this? But we must understand how this immediate triple crisis actually affect women. Now, the organization of women, whether there is COVID or not, but even more so in this context, remains absolutely essential and absolutely important. But the question facing the SACP is also that of the organization of women, as always. But what do we mean now? The question facing the SACP is not so much to establish our own women's league or our own women's section, but to dynamically link up with existing progressive women's organizations. Communists have been very good in doing this, not in an entryist fashion, but by being part of those structures, whether it's the ANC Women's League, whether it's women in trade unions, in school governing bodies. By the way, women are always the majority. You go to any school governing body meeting, in any rural village or township, it's 80% women. Women in stokvels, women in burial societies, women in cooperatives, in the informal economy, and indeed in the churches. That's where women are. And the task of the SACP is to dynamically link with existing women's organizations That's very important. Of course, the party must also contribute to build new forms of women organizations where necessary and where they are required. As I have said, when we talk about the crisis of social reproduction, we are talking about actually at the heart of it, this fear of intense women's oppression and exploitation, the heart of patriarchy. And therefore, the crisis, dealing with the multiple crises of social reproduction, means we are in a site of struggle to organize women. And I'm sure you will discuss this. I don't want to go into detail, and I don't want to take all your time. Now, what this means, in a little bit of a theoretical posing of the issue, we need to develop an integrated approach that recognizing the interrelated nature and connection between the endemic crisis of capitalism, the crisis of social reproduction, and gender-based violence, which, by the way, has become worse. Although it might be interesting to actually interrogate this, if I may just pose an awkward question. Has gender-based violence increased during this time, or COVID-19 and the lockdown has simply exposed the nature and the extent of gender-based violence in our society? That otherwise we may not have been aware, or it may not have been in the general eye. Of course, there is an increase. It's very clear. But at the same time, more has been exposed during the lockdown and COVID-19 than ordinarily has been outside of these conditions. As the SACP, we have taken another very important resolution coming out of our 14th Congress, that of building a popular left front, uniting organized workers, organizing the unorganized, and linking up with different forms of progressive structures in society, both inside and outside the alliance. Organized workers, we said, also both inside COSATU and outside COSATU. We've given ourselves, by the way, a very huge task. Of course, comrades, the idea of a left popular front emerged at a particular time. It emerged at a time when, in the run-up to Nasrec conference of the ANC, where we were very much afraid, communists are never often afraid, but we were very much afraid that the ANC may not return from Nasrec, that it was likely to implode. And therefore, as the SACP, we said, if that happens, we must not be found wanting. As the SACP, we can't be the ANC. We can never replace the ANC, but we may want to build a progressive core of forces who still believe in the necessity of the National Democratic Revolution to try and replace an imploded African National Congress. That was part of our thinking. But this Left Popular Front was not only just limited to that. Even as we have the ANC now, we still need to organize a whole range of progressive forces, some of which are outside our alliance. We know as the party, we have fought very concrete battles, for instance, around ESCOM, in particular around SAA. We're working with NUMSA, which has left COSATU, and other trade unions. Other forces are beginning to reach out to the Communist Party, by the way, over the last few years, to say, let's work together, including ANC cadres who have never been in the Communist Party, who are saying, but we need to work together. In other words, there have been additional pressures on the SACP at this point in time. Now, in organizing women then, we must also say, women are going to be a very crucial component of any popular left front, and women's organization must find expression inside that. And even lead parts. Women must lead part of that broad left popular front, or even campaigns in particular. But at the same time, comrades, one of the biggest challenges we are facing, we must fight all forms of vulgarization of women's struggles and their opportunistic use to advance all sorts of regressive and backward tendency like corruption, factionalism, and access to positions for purposes of personal accumulation. This is a disease we are facing. That there are forces inside our movement and outside who are using the issue of women's struggles for perverse purposes, not for progressive purposes. We must expose this as the SACP and defeat it. That is one of the most important roles of especially our women commissariat. That is why gender struggles and women's struggles, the two are not the same, of course, but they are deeply interlinked, must always be underpinned by class, anti-imperialist, and non-racial content and outlook. As communists, we must always expose and seek to combat use of women's and gender struggles to advance narrow nationalist interests. So also must we defeat reactionary feminism that see all men as the enemy instead of capitalism and patriarchy as the enemy. Progressive women's struggles in the Congress movement, I can say with confidence, have never been anti-men in that narrow sense. It is for this reason that working class women must be at the center of women's struggles. And it is the SACP's Women's Commissariat that must aim to build this capacity and be at the forefront of providing this direction. Now, I want to move towards ending by raising two contemporary issues and challenges. As we say, we are not building a women's commissariat in abstract, but we are building it in struggles, in particular concrete conditions and circumstances. One of the biggest challenges we are facing now, comrades, is that of corruption. But it's interesting. The challenge of corruption is at the same time now the challenge that is facing the movement and a threat to the very survival of the movement. Now, as communists, we must not be conspiratorial in our analysis. But let me pose this uncomfortable question so that it doesn't only worry me to wake up at night, run out of sleep at 2 a.m. in the morning, and often never fall asleep again, or you start falling asleep at 6 when you have to be waking up. Well, Sister Tenji may say, Blade, it's age. Don't worry. But during that time when I'm awake, I'm worrying. Is there no advanced agenda now to actually collapse the ANC from within? The enemy has tried over decades to infiltrate the African National Congress and failed. But I am sitting with a very uncomfortable feeling just seeing what is happening. Whether the forces who were wanting to destroy the ANC have not actually captured a lot of our structures. How do you justify removing a mayor of eThekwini on the basis of corruption? And you swear that mayor in as a member of the legislature, blatantly so, arrogantly so. How do you have a Secretary General, I'm sorry to say this, of the ANC, who says there is not a single ANC leader who hasn't child money, and what's wrong if my son gets a tender of PPE, despite the fact that the son can't produce any PPEs? Just the blatant.
Yeah.
Wait, is there no agenda? Is the ANC actually not now been captured internally by forces who want to at last destroy it? Well, sometimes when you raise this, the issue of the former Durban mayor, we are told, yeah, we are being anti-women because the mayor is a woman. But the issue of corruption, comrades, I was having a lot to say, but I think I don't want to be delaying this, but the fight against corruption is central. But also I want to say something that I was thinking about as I was preparing for this input. Much as what I'm talking about is not my input, it's largely the party's positions. But as I was preparing myself, I was saying, shouldn't we also be saying the fight against corruption must also be gendered and be tackled from the standpoint of women as well? Otherwise, there is a danger that it would just be a male struggle, often a fight amongst males, and it may not be all able to go to the roots of corruption, which also has its patriarchal features. I'm posing this even as a theoretical question, by the way. I don't know, maybe that's going too far in trying to analyze this. But as we meet today, we have to fight and intensify the struggle against corruption. We have to convince our comrades that cleansing the ANC is the contemporary major task of the revolution. We can't allow this ANC to collapse. I know in the party at the moment, some of our comrades will say, yes, Comrade Blade, we have long told you, let's contest elections on our own. Well, there's a debate in the party. Some of us feel strongly that that's walking away. That would be walking away from the responsibility of the revolution. Even if the ANC can collapse tomorrow, this country will still need a broad movement to be able to actually take forward the national democratic revolution. There are many other challenges, comrades, in society that sometimes I feel. I'm ending on a personal note. The political is personal, as they say. Sometimes I do feel actually that women can do much better than us. And I'm saying this from personal experience, by the way. I grew up in a woman-handed household. My mother was poor, but I never remember once sleeping, having not had something to eat. I don't know how she did it. So placing women at the center of the revolution, we also placing different experience and often caring experiences that the revolution needs, even more so now, as we face a lot of other regressive tendencies in society. Increase in drug dealing. You know, the fact that in South Africa today, when the president announces that we are lifting the restrictions on the sale of alcohol, it's like New Year's Eve in the country. What does that mean? Where is our society and the importance of women on that score? Comrades, with those words, I unfortunately am supposed to have joined, as I had said to comrades, another meeting at 11. I cannot be able to stay long. I wish I was going to be able to be part of this for myself, just to listen and engage. But I'm very pleased, Comrade Soli and Comrade Jenny and Comrade Joyce, that at last we are reconvening this commissariat annually. But this must not just be an annual event. The annual event must facilitate the women's issues to be a daily preoccupation of the South African Communist Party at all levels of our structures. Socialism is the future, build it now. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Comrade GS. We really want to thank a powerful keynote address that is going to assist our conference to deliberate. There are various very important issues that you have raised, GS. We want to thank you for that. And some of them are serious challenges that we should actually confront while we will be deliberating during the course of this day. And again, GS, I'm sure the issue that you have also raised about the country does require a broad movement even if we can have the ANC not collapsing, but we still need a movement, possibly we need to ask ourselves, is this the kind of a broad movement we want as it is happening at the moment? And that broad question possibly should sink, we should delve deep, find out what is wrong, and particularly also, this conference should actually try to get some solutions, because at the moment, the movement is tainted badly. We are just in trouble. Before I can even proceed and go to the international solidarity message by the ambassador of Palestine, who will be talking on women in Palestine and women in diplomacy, can I just indicate that, or maybe give a special welcome, which was not done earlier on, to our Young Communist League of South Africa, which is part of this conference. Again, comrades, we also have the second deputy president of POP, Comrade Boni, who is also leading the structure, the gender structure of POP.
Comrade Treasurer.
That.
Comrade Treasurer.
Yes, comrade. I'm listening. Comrade Bulelo, are you calling me?
Just before the GS leave, at least you must not forget that there's still a convener of this commission, Comrade, in the name of Comrade Tunyiswa. In case people are confused what is happening, we are still convening this commission. So you must also mention the convener of this commission. Thank you very much for that. Yes.
My
Comrade,
apologies, Comrade
I mentioned the
Tunyiswa.
convener so that I
Point
proceed. Yes, there is a convener, Comrade. Yes, I was about to come to that also. The convener of this conference, a special acknowledgement. Is a pity the convener entered while I was still talking, but I know the convener was thinking about the GS having to leave the platform before mentioning her. That is acknowledged, Comrade Bulelwa. And also, I think it's important for us to thank the head office staff for all the work that they've done to ensure that they host this conference led by Comrade Jennifer Schreiner, who is the head of secretariat. I know that they've done a lot of work. And I must say, while we're talking about the convener of the agenda, of the coordinator of the gender commission, we need to indicate that this commission has been working very, very hard during the past days to even come to the current conference that is convened, and we would like to thank the convener for being very active and ensuring that all that work it's really taking place. They have been sitting without fail, engaging in various issues, participating in various platforms, which actually keeps the party alive, and that is so much appreciated. Comrades, without any waste of time, can I then proceed to the next contribution? As I've mentioned, is the international solidarity. I will request the ambassador to Palestine to take the podium in this system. Thank you very much.
Joyce, sorry, comrades, I'm going to be leaving. My apologies also for not recognizing the ambassador of Palestine to South Africa. Ambassador, you are always most welcome to our platforms. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thanks. And then thereafter, I will just hand over to the next comrade to proceed to facilitate after the ambassador. So I won't be coming back. Ambassador, over to you, and then over to Comrade Bulelo Tunyiswa.
Thank you, Comrade Joyce, and I would love to thank the South African Communist Party on behalf of the Palestinian women for this kind invitation for such an important virtual conference on women in such a very difficult and distinct times. Of course, I've been joined by the South African Communist Party in different occasions, despite of the situation and despite of the pandemic. And in this regard, I would love to thank them for the initiative of writing letters to Palestinian prisoners, despite of the difficult situation. Allow me here to pay special tributes to all comrades, women comrades here joining me in this platform, to the South African women in general, celebrating their month. And special tribute also goes to women in war zones and in areas of conflict, especially in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and everywhere where women had to shoulder the burden of wars and the burden of other challenges faced by them in such difficult areas and difficult times. Also, allow me to express the sincere appreciation to the South African government and its people for their continuous support and unwavering solidarity with our just struggle for freedom, peace, and independence. I would love to start from where Comrade Blade ended with a personal note, which really touched my heart deeply, because we do believe that women are women, the same. They share the same worries and the same responsibilities all over the world. And I would love to say on a different note that revolution is a woman. There has never been any uprising against oppression, colonialism, or racial segregation anywhere around the world that wasn't shouldered first and foremost by women. In Palestine and the rest of the Middle East area, where we have seen recent uprising, it's no different. Our voices are loud and clear in all struggles in relation to justice, freedom, and human rights. What is wrong, however, and I'm talking in the Middle East, and of course I think it's common all over the world, is that societies are plagued with patriarchy. I would say so because and not despite of years of colonialism, occupation, and marginalization. Part of the liberation struggle then is to liberate women from occupation first, in our case, and from the patriarchal hegemony second. Just as the feminist movement motto in Palestine says, there is no free homeland without free women. And to talk specifically and more precisely of the Palestinian women, then we have to talk about Palestinian women under the Israeli prolonged occupation. We say that Palestinian women regularly face violence, threats, intimidation, restriction on movement, and discrimination as a result of the Israeli policies that violate international humanitarian and human rights law. If we are to talk about the violations, then we have to mention some of them, which include, but of course not limited to, first of all, house demolition and property destruction, aggression and targeting of civilians, expansion of settlements and settler violence, forcible eviction of Palestinians from occupied Jerusalem, and the collective punishment as a tool in forcible transfer. And finally, targeting Palestinian women human rights defenders, women journalists, and activists. Of course, these are the major or the main violations. Under each one lies a huge set of practices and procedures that affect the Palestinian women. Let me talk about each one in particular so that to assess the impact of these practices on the lives of Palestinian women and Palestinian families as a result. First of all, let's talk about housing demolitions and property destruction. Of course, this remains an overwhelming fear and daily reality for many women living in occupied Palestine, especially in East Jerusalem. The result of intimidation and possibility of losing a livelihood has profound economic, social, and psychological consequences on women and their families, who are often left homeless or resulted to live in overcrowded or less than adequate conditions. You can imagine what burden the woman has to shoulder when she loses her home. It's whether we liked it or not, women are always the backbone of their families. So they are the one who think how to provide adequate and sufficient and appropriate houses or a place to live or a roof or a shelter for their families. Second, let's talk about the aggression and targeting of civilians. Military occupation within has led a wave of surge of violence against the Palestinian population by the Israeli military and has had disastrous effects on the sense of safety for Palestinian women and girls. Soldiers are heavily armed, citizens are threatened, having weapons pointed toward them, and being forcibly removed from their homes in the middle of the night, and personal items are damaged or stolen. These practices causes severe psychological distress and terror to civilians, especially women and their children. As for the third violation, which is expansion of settlements and settler violence, of course, the Israeli occupation has been leading a settlement enterprise long time ago. What does it mean? The expansion or the creation of settlements always means the grabbing of the Palestinian land on daily basis. This grabbing of Palestinian land to construct or to expand the settlements means that to take the land that is surrounding the area of the settlement. To take the land means that as Palestinians, we are not allowed to go around these areas. If you go there, if your child was there by mistake, if your husband, your brother, your father was there by mistake, in the wrong time, in the wrong place, then you are an easy target for the Israeli soldiers and the Israeli settlers. You can imagine the kind of worrying the woman had to live in, especially if you are living in an area surrounding an Israeli settlement, illegal settlement, of course, because you are always under the fear that you might lose property, your land, or the soul of your beloved, because you are in a place that you shouldn't be there that time. So it's very difficult for women to live psychologically under this burden of tension and worrying for losing either your beloved ones or your home and property due to the Israeli settlement colonial enterprise. If we are talking about another violation, it's the forcible eviction of Palestinians from occupied territory, especially Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and the collective punishment as a tool in forcible transfer. In an attempt to maintain demographic majority, Israel has used a variety of methods to reduce the Palestinian population in the city of Jerusalem. Since the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, which took place in the 1980s, Israel has treated Palestinians, especially women, as immigrants in their own country and in their own city. Residency revocation is the most direct tool used to forcibly transfer Palestinians from East Jerusalem. And when we are talking about this, we are targeting mainly women, because usually a woman, when she got married, she has to move to her husband's house, especially if her husband, so if you are living in the West Bank, because here we are talking about different dynamics in the Palestinian area. We are talking about the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So if you are a woman residing in West Bank or Gaza, then you have to marry a man from East Jerusalem. Then you will not be allowed to take the residency immediately as a normal human being or a normal citizen. So what the Israelis are trying to do is usually to revoke your residency. So the woman here has two choices: either to stay at home in a prison, afraid of even getting out because you don't have the permit to move from one place to another. And Israel is especially is Jerusalem is full of checkpoints just to maintain security and to maintain their control. Or on the other hand, you might go out, but also you might get arrested, and then you will be deported to West Bank or Gaza to live with your original family and deny the access to see your family and your kids in East Jerusalem. So you can imagine the kind of dilemma or the kind of fear the women in living in East Jerusalem are under, and what kind of pressure this leaves on them and also on their families. It's that feeling of that you might be deported or you have to live in a prison. It's a very difficult situation, and when we are talking about it in general, it seems that it's something, it's okay, we can imagine it, but when it comes to details, it's really a horrifying situation. And the last thing that we were talking about is targeting women human rights defenders, women journalists, and activists. Women human rights defenders have been frequently targeted and have suffered gravely from such attacks by the occupying power. They have been subjected to night raids, arrests, and measures under the pretext of incitement. After criticizing, for instance, Israeli occupation practices, including such criticism that goes even to social media channels such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on. Of course, none of these women journalists obtained legal redress, either because they were too afraid to report or because Israeli authorities did not investigate or prosecute these violations. You can imagine what kind of a situation the Palestinian woman under the Israeli occupation is living under. Because, as I mentioned, whether we like it or not, women are the backbones of their families. And of course, you can imagine that Palestinian women themselves are subjected to arrest and detention most of the time. Now, in the Israeli prisons, we still have around 60 Palestinian women in detention, struggling for their freedom, struggling with unfair and inhuman practices by the Israeli authorities, especially now with the threat of the coronavirus pandemic spreading in the Israeli jails. So it's very difficult to talk about these measures. Despite all these difficulties and despite of the difficult political situation, through time, the Palestinian women have shown great examples of dedication and wholehearted commitment for the good of their people and their country. And to talk about that, in Palestine, we have many women who have taken pioneer roles in both the armed and the political struggle against the Israeli occupation. To name some of them, and of course not all, because our society is filled of examples of Palestinian women, we remember our beloved martyr Dalal al-Morabi, who had led a group of Palestinian freedom fighters against the Israeli colonial occupation. And of course, we do salute from here our beloved freedom fighter Layla Khalid, who's living now in Jordan. Of course, we cannot deny the great role of Palestinian Samiha Khalil, who entered the Palestinian presidential elections of the 1996 Of course, we can always note the speeches by Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, who's lately was brave to have a tweet on the political situation and on the Israeli normalization with some of the Arab countries, a tweet that a man would not have the dare to say. Let's be, because women are always decisive and strong when it comes to crunch issues. Of course, as a diplomats and as women in diplomacy, we can mention many of the Palestinian women who have joined and shaped the Palestinian diplomacy as we know now. We salute Ambassador Layla Shahid, who has been serving for Palestine in Brussels as the EU incubator and in France for quite a long time. We also salute Ambassador Maikeli, who served in Chile and Italy, and now she's the Minister of Health, and she's doing a marvelous job in fighting against the coronavirus pandemic. Many of the Palestinians, I myself, I feel proud to be in lineage and continuation of such heritage of Palestinian leaders and Palestinian ambassadors as well. And in line of these, of course, usually we say as women that rights are taken and are not granted. But on the other hand, the state of Palestine, despite the fact we still fighting the Israeli occupation, but internally we tried to give the Palestinian women as a small portion of their rights, because in the years of struggle for liberation and struggle against the Israeli occupation, women stood shoulder to shoulder with the men to achieve this objective. And actually, the state of Palestine is committed also to achieve women empowerment, because we do believe that empowering a woman is empowering a nation. And this commitment is reflected in the numerous steps that has been taken by the Palestinian government, both on national and on the international level. Let's start first of all by the national level, then we will move to the international. In 2004, the Palestinian government decided to establish the Ministry of Women's Affairs to be the body that takes care of women's issues, especially when it comes to legislations and when it comes to making the adaptation to make the harmonization between the international conventions like CEDAW and the national laws and bylaws. In 2012, the State of Palestine established a high-level national committee for the implementation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution Women 1325 on women, peace, and security, led by the Ministry of Women's Affairs in partnership with the relevant ministries and NGOs. In 2014, the State of Palestine has expressed its willingness to enhance the rights of women by acceding to the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and to the Convention on the Political Rights of Women without reservations. And this is we were one of the rare countries in the area or even in the world that we express our willingness to exceed CEDAW without any kind of reservation. In 2016, the State of Palestine was among the 68 countries and areas that adopted a national two-year action plan to implement the resolution on women, peace, and security. This action plan, adopted by both the government and the civil society organizations, had three main objectives. First, it aims to protect Palestinian women and girls from violations of the Israeli occupation first. Second, it aims to hold the Israeli occupation accountable nationally and internationally for their violations. And third, it aims to enhance the participation of women in decision-making process, including peacemaking and conflict resolution, both on a local and international level. And actually, my presence here as an ambassador to South Africa, to an African country, is a testament to this commitment. Also, in line of these measures that has been taken by the Palestinian government, we can see a resolution has been adopted to ensure the participation of women in recent reconciliation process between the internal Palestinian factions. And everyone knows about the debate in this area, but we do still believe that women, when they come into issues of reconciliation, they will do much better than men, because woman is life, woman is a mother, woman is a wife. She can do things in a different manner, and she can also think in different aspects when it comes to bringing people together. Another thing that has been taken is the women participation empowerment are also important and cross-cutting objective in the context of the Palestinian National Policy Agenda, which was adopted for the years 2017-2022. In 2017, the State of Palestine established the National Committee for the Harmonization of National Legislations with its work by review with the international treaties and conventions. The committee has committed its work by reviewing the applicable penal law and has already set its priorities concerning the other legislations that will be reviewed by its members to ensure their compliance with the international standards regarding the respects of human rights and gender equality. This was on the national level. As for the international level, efforts are also, we do believe that efforts are also necessary on the international level. The particular importance of the situation of and assistance for Palestinian women has been recognized notably by the ECOSOC resolution of the year 2010. In more general terms, any resolutions that promote the Palestinian rights, including the right to self-determination, will lead to women's empowerment. International cooperation and coalition with existing platforms is essential to pursue the empowerment of women. The State of Palestine encourages the following things when it comes to the international level. Of course, the increase of participation of women in decision-making processes by developing their representation at the leadership level, especially in the main UN bodies. Unify the position of women's movements all over the world concerning violence and discrimination against women by agreeing on specific measures to be taken in this regard. Provide special services and assistance for women refugees around the world and build their capacities in all aspects of UN women. Finally, and most importantly, the adoption of UN resolutions on the empowerment of women and the adoption of more international conventions related to women's rights. These are the efforts that has been taken by the government of Palestine nationally and internationally. Of course, there has been many debate, a broad debate on the level of participation, on the quota, whether we need a quota or not. But because of the internal situation in Palestine now and the existential threats by the Israeli colonial expansionist enterprise, debates are sometimes high in times of stability, and they get lower in times of zones and in times of threats, because sometimes and because we are women, sometimes we put the issue of debating aside when it comes to existential threats as we face right now. I would love to end by saying it's a hope And final note that women in our region are organizing locally, regionally, and globally to bring on the top their own agendas, their plight, and their causes. It is through these small grassroots movements and networking on a larger scale that can lead to create the necessary space for social debate and ultimately political change. This is something we're looking for, we hope for, and we're struggling for whenever we have the margin to do so. Uh, Thank you. Thank you for you, and thank you for South Africa for dedicating a month, a whole month for women to celebrate. And I would love to salute the South African women who in the past paved the way for this huge representation by women in the government. And I'm sure that my presence here will be enriched by more and more engagement with such pioneer women like you here in the Communist Party and in other parties in the government and in the grassroots organization. Thank you for giving again me this chance to be among such pioneer comrades. And Amandla.
Away too. Oh, thank you, Ambassador, for the entire outline of what is happening in Palestine and the path that is facing our comrades. We were actually with you on this battle, but thanks for also alerting us and bringing all those aspects in the forefront, so that once we also deliberate, because Palestine is critical for us, we integrate also part of the program of what we will be doing to Palestine. It's not an easy situation, but we have to win. Thank you, Comrade Ambassador. I am going to just do a minor amendment, comrades, on what I have actually indicated earlier on. The facilitator that will be following, it won't be Comrade Bulola at the moment, but we're going to hand over to Comrade Koliswa Fihlani, who will be assisting us with the coming session. I need to check, Comrade Koliswa, are you ready? Are you there? Comrade Koliswa, unmute. Where are you?
Yes, thank you, National Treasurer. I'm having a challenge with the network sometimes because I come in and out of the meeting. I was difficulty even in terms of hearing, but I'll catch up in some of the areas. Comrade Bulelo, are you still around?
Yes, I am.
Yes, you can also just by introduce Comrade Geraldine, because we'll also have Comrade Pet, who are both have a history of the trade unionism in their background. Over to you, Comrade Bulelo. Okay, if you are not there. Comrades, we have an honor to have Comrade Geraldine in our midst, who unfortunately also told that there's another engagement after this. You just raised some of those issues, and those issues that she will be raising are for us to interact and also to digest, as the General Secretary has put forward, that in terms of our own theoretical background, we're trying to shape our work. Comrade Fraser, we know you are not a stranger in this terrain. You've been in various areas, in various leadership positions, even within the ANC, in the highest echelons of the organization itself, and NK combatant, now in the space of the United Nations. Even locally, in shaping our social discourse and in the economic front. So in various fronts, you'll find women. May we just hand over to you now to share some of your thoughts today in this Women's Commissars Conference. Over to you. Let's welcome Comrade Jacqueline from Lady. Warm welcome. Just hand a round of applause. Their hands in the technology's hands. You even need to clap. Their hands. There's a sign. Thank you very much. Over to you, Comrade.
Yeah, thank you very much, comrades, and thanks for being here. I thought that if Comrade Tenji hasn't gone off yet, or should I say Ambassador Mtinso now, I wanted to just, shall I say, prod a little bit or teaser. You know, comrades, there was a time when Comrade Tenji and I were the only two women in the Politburo of the party. I think Comrade Jenny Schreiner will recall that quite vividly. I think additional point to raise, and something that's not much spoken about, even I don't talk about it, but I think I can do so today, is that I think I was the first woman deputy chairman of the party. You know, it's also something that's not remembered, I think for good reason. So just wanted to put that on the table. And I was just poking Comrade Tenji earlier when I was listening to the input by the General Secretary, when I said to her, don't you think this is so much of a sense of déjà vu when you listen to this particular input? Because I think it's quite known that the likes of Comrade Tenji, Comrade Jenny, various other comrades who were in the Central Committee of the party at the time, and in leadership structures across the party, you would recall the debates around the party actually looking at the whole issue of greater participation of women in the leadership echelons, not only of the party, but of the movement as a whole. So I'd want to congratulate the party and comrades today who's worked on this particular summit, this conference that's taking place, and also the fact that it's an annual conference, and it's a conference that's for commissars, women commissars in the party, because at the end of the day, the commissars are the lifeblood of the party. Now, let me step back, and I'd want to acknowledge the ambassadors present here today. And I'm not just, I'm talking about the Palestinian and the Cuban ambassador and others, in order that it's, I don't act inappropriately. I'd also want to do a shout out to Reniva. Reniva has been writing from far afield. I think we're all aware she's in Damascus, Syria. And it seems she has more time to write about those things that otherwise she didn't have time for. So well done, Reniva, and keep up the writing. And also in the spirit of internationalism, bring the message from the women revolutionaries in that region, bring it into the house, bring it into the party, and help build on what is there. Now, I suppose maybe not to shock and horror, but unsurprisingly, when I was preparing for this, I went to fetch, went to look at the books we have, and I pulled out this one. We have a number of Progress publisher books, a whole series. And I thought, let me go to the one called the Dictionary of Scientific Communism and look at the family under socialism and communism. And I thought that the feminists, and Pat, yourself included, would want to look at how it was defined. And the fact that the family is defined correctly so as a form of a community of people connected by marital and blood relations, having specifically biological functions of reproducing the human race. The family is at the same time a form of people's social community, and as such has an important economic and intellectual function. But what's quite important about the definition is not the part that I mentioned, but in this definition, it talks about what happens under the dominance of private property, the fact that one of its most important functions is accumulation and preservation of property. And that's why priority is often given in concluding marriages to the accumulation of property rather than any spiritual and physiological affinity between partners or the upbringing of children. Socialism, it's defined that socialism radically changes the economic foundation of the family and the relations between its members. Now, what's spoken about in some detail under the definition is of the equality of women and their involvement in social production, the social maintenance of old people, and the growing participation of society in the maintenance of children lead to the economic independence of family members and the democratization of intra-family relations. And they go on to say the gradual abolition of social, estate, national, and religious prejudices and economic equality makes the family a free union of equal people, close quotes. Very clearly, we've not reached that point, and I think we would argue, those of us in the room and outside the virtual room, that there's certain aspects that hasn't been fully factored in at the time the definition was crafted. If we look at present day, and also much as it talks about the moral and psychological factors that increase and family members become more exacting towards one another and have a keener sense of duty, I'm not quite sure if we see that, and we even see it, whether we even see it amongst party comrades. And yeah, I talk about comrades even in leadership echelons in the party, and to what extent do we hold ourselves accountable and so on. So Comrade Jenny did the Jenny thing, and I think many of us know that, and Tenji has alluded to that earlier. She didn't so much ask, Comrade Geraldine, are you available to come in, and will you consider this following topic? I was more or less instructed to do this. Now, I simply said to her that I am more available today than the original date of this. And I promptly got a follow-up email this week that says, this is the agenda, this is the program, and here you are. So if I don't do full justice to the program, understand that this was within particular constraints, and I'll try the best I can. I also did some broader reading, looking at the whole issue of the crisis of social reproduction, and also the hidden crisis of women's social reproduction and the political economy of care in Africa, and essentially drew on work of, shall I say, people who may consider themselves as socialists, and we may not find them in predictable places. And yeah, I went to work of someone who's, for example, at the London School of Film, Media and Design, called Helen Hester, who has written on this topic. And I thought that it's part of raising ideas, stimulating ideas, because when you have and are developing a commissariat, it's people who are going to engage in debate. So the first thing I'd want to touch on in terms of the topic is the fact that in recent years there's been much discussion around the crisis of work. And this has been in many instances discussed with respect to the fourth industrial revolution and what will happen to work. But I think something that's happened more recently, and this is with in the context of COVID-19, where it's actually brought this together. And as we see, and I will want to use the words of the Secretary General of the UN, and I'm going to paraphrase him. When he spoke at the annual Nelson Mandela lecture, he said that COVID-19 has in essence been like an X-ray that has really highlighted the fault lines, my word, the fault lines, or highlighted the inequalities that are there globally. And obviously, when these are highlighted, it brings to the fore generally the best and the worst. And I think we've seen more of the worst coming up. So going back to the question of the crisis of work, I want to reflect this in particular with respect to the whole issue of social production and reproduction and unpaid work. And I will draw on a definition of social reproduction as the process making it possible for individuals, family, and society itself to continue. I want to take it further and say that this is also in reference to the invisible and undervalued realm of the economy. Comrade Pat Horn is going to speak after me, and Comrade Pat Horn has always had quite a strong and clear lens on the whole issue of informality and the informal sector, but she will talk about that separately. And I am going to come to a greater extent to the issue of the crisis of work, which is also a crisis of the home, and the fact that this is to a large degree, this is systemic, and it is argued by this Helen, the systemic and integrated character of our present struggles. So this reproductive labor are terms that are describing the activities that nurture future workers. It regenerates the current workforce and it maintains those who cannot work. It's a set of tasks that together maintain and reproduce life, both daily and generationally. So it's broadly about caring about oneself and others, childcare, elder care, and healthcare. So what came through the most strongest during the COVID pandemic is the fact that this invisible work or unpaid work has almost become the most important. And whilst there's been the acknowledgement in broader society and the economy of, whilst there's this recognition that at certain levels and spheres, these are most important. During this time, health workers, our educators to a degree, but particularly our care workers have been the ones that have been recognized as very important. The invisible workers have become important. When you look at remuneration, it never follows, and it's something to be taken into account. And these forms of work is often neglected in current day debates about work. It's pushed to the background and pretended that it's not there. And hence I had gone to Progress Publishers and looked at that definition, because again, if you looked at the definition in that instance, it says this is a very essential part of what's required in order to ensure that other members of the family or society are able to be economically active and productive in the formal economy. So there is a need to review this, and as we are aware, traditionally, a social reproduction has been seen as the interface, and I've mentioned this, between the home and the workplace. It's also understood to have very concrete activities. Now, let me just raise one thing, and this is something that we all acknowledge, a debate that's been there over decades and so on. So for those of us who can afford to hopefully pay a decent wage to someone who's a domestic worker, to what extent do we also take into account that he or she has a family and has to draw on this unpaid wage through family members who will support their households to take things forward? Sorry. So I think that I just wanted to trigger this and stimulate this debate. And I'd want to conclude with three further broad points. The one being the fact that we have the reality of things like, and this has been spoken about very much this morning, patriarchy and gender-based violence, also impacting and being an extra, well, it's not even an extra layer. I mean, patriarchy is so universal and enduring. And the whole issue of unpaid work is precisely as enduring as it, well, patriarchy, because of unpaid work, will also proliferate going forward, and we take that into account. So just quickly about the political economy of care in Africa, and here I drew on some reading from Randria Maro, who spoke about the political economy of care centers on the unpaid work of African women in socially reproducing workers, as well as caring for the sick in society. And again, the definitions are much the same. But he quotes Debbie Budlander quite extensively, and in 2008, Debbie Budlander pointed to the monetary value of what we could call unpaid work as constituting at that point between 10 and 39% of a country's gross domestic product, if it was to, if we were to really put a number to it in terms of GDP terms. And also, he talks about the fact that social reproduction is contested, contradictory, and maybe unsustainable. Now, why is that? And here in work of Diane Elson, it stated in recent history that global food, financial and economic crisis had threatened the social reproduction of human beings, as well as the social reproduction of capitalist money in the banking system, together with the social reproduction of capitalist production, close quotes. Now, I think that's quite a mouthful, and I hope I know the GS said we shouldn't be theoretical about it, but I think as I am quoting this, I think the reality is that it's this very theory that we see practically playing out in our lives, practically playing out in society, and how we deal with it is going to require us to unpack these underpinnings to it. So maybe the last point that I should raise around this is the fact, or maybe I should go to the three key elements that was pointed to. The first, the reality that I think we're all aware of, and that's the sexual division of labor in public and private spheres, that's underpinned by gender norms and ideologies that hold women primarily responsible for unpaid work in the households. Caring professions in public sphere and labor market are also similar to feminize unpaid care work and the fact that it's also undervalued. And I spoke about the value issue earlier. The second element as well is that the global macroeconomic environment always looks at a quest for cheap sources of labor and maximizing profit that have disrupted local economies and dramatically changed labor markets. And I think the big issue is that in the current moment with COVID, seeing that people claim there's a potential for a reset button, that we should look at whether we can change that. And this is what I throw out to the commissars in the party. It may be an issue you engage with. And then finally, the issue of the gendered impacts of globalization. And this is in many instances that the privatization of public services and infrastructure that regresses women's rights by placing a greater burden on their labor in the household, as well as the establishment of political and legal systems. And as I raise that, I conclude by saying it's a good moment to look at this now, because globally there's a discourse that says that public service is more important now than at any other point. And again, we should be careful in South Africa that this debate is not minimized in any way whatsoever, that we review the public service. But for that to happen, we also need to ensure that it is a capable and developmental state that we're talking about. I heard the Secretary General talk about corruption being one of the biggest challenges that we face in South Africa. And I actually want to locate that challenge and add to it. I think our biggest challenge is actually inequality in society and how we deal with that in all its facets. And secondly, within that, looking at the need for us to have economic growth that is one that will look at job creation even within a new economy as it comes about. And as you deal with this, you deal with governance as part of that, and corruption falls within the governance side. But as we confront the one battle, we mustn't overlook the other and bigger struggle. Thank you very much, and over to you, Chairperson or Facilitator.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope you have a few more minutes with us. I do not know how much time you have, but anytime that so that we usher in Comrade Pat. But if you do not have that much, I'm not sure you prefer interactions now.
I will stay and listen
prefer-
to Comrade Pat. Yes, I will stay and listen to Comrade Pat.
Okay, thank you very much. Comrade Pat is our Central Committee member who's also a feminist and is also a social activist. May I just quickly hand over to you so that we have much time in interactions. Thank you, Comrade Pat.
Hi, Comrade Koliswa, thank you. And greetings to everybody here. It's such a pleasure to be here in this forum today. I'm just really sorry that I've got a meeting at 2, but it's a meeting about preparing for forcing our government to ratify Convention 190 for the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. And we've been, pushing for some time, and so I really need to be there at 2. But I hope that we'll have a chance to have quite a bit of discussion before I can go. I'm really happy that I was preceded by Comrade Geraldine, because Comrade, you've put forward a whole lot of issues that I don't need to repeat, and that helps me to avoid sort of overstepping my time, which I always seem to end up tending to do. I've been asked to talk about organizing women in public sector, private sector, and informal economy for socialism. So I'm not going to actually spend much time talking about the statistics of the labor market, although there are very good statistics available, and there's some really good statistics that recently got produced. They're called NIDS CRAM papers, National Income Dynamic Study of the Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey. And they've actually done some number crunching at short notice to show what's happened to people during the coronavirus, during the lockdown, in fact, starting from February. And then it's got sort of about 12 specialized topics. One of them is a gender analysis, which shows really clearly about, it basically says that of the total net job loss between February and April, which was about 2.9 million jobs that were lost, 2/3 of those were women. And this is an old story, comrades. Whenever we have a crisis, women are the first or the bigger numbers to be affected. And it also shows, because it goes into, sorry, start my video. Okay. It also shows how both women and men experienced greater childcare responsibilities during lockdown, but women carried much more of that responsibility. It basically looks at the gendered effects of the crisis in the early lockdown. I'm quite sure that the story is going to get worse and worse as we go along. On the other hand, the issue about organizing women, which I've been asked to talk about, people get organized more easily when they're having better hardship, and sometimes the most impressive women's leadership comes up when women are facing these difficulties. And so when it goes to organizing different kinds of women in all these sectors that have been mentioned, public and private sector, as well as informal, face they face economic oppression, they face patriarchal oppression. It might actualize in different ways for different people. Some women are doing completely unpaid work, and Comrade Geraldine has covered that quite a bit. But of course, it increases during a time like this because of the social tasks that are needed to be done. So I want to jump straight into the issue of organizing, because I think if we're talking about a socialist future, which is to a large extent women-led, we need to really confront the issue about organizing women and what are the tasks that we have in front of us. I was happy that the GS was very frank in his analysis, and talked about the importance of the personal being political, and which is certainly helps. And to be very frank about, how bad our record really is in the SACP, and what are the kinds of things we need to do to get ourselves into a better space where it comes to a much stronger level of women leadership for our struggles. So I want to start with the issue of when women workers organize. Obviously, the first structure they organize in are trade unions. And, that's where the problem starts, because the trade unions are patriarchal social structures. I've had the good fortune to be both in the formal sector trade unions, as well as organize in the informal economy in much more women-dominated organizations. So to see, different sides of the story. But when we started to organize women in the informal economy, I'm afraid to say that one of the tasks we set ourselves, and I think we succeeded, was to use the trade unions as a good example of what not to do when it comes to, organizing women. Because during my time in the trade unions, we organized. I was in very male-dominated sectors. I was in the chemical and the paper sector. And so we needed to establish women's committees in order to organize. Later on, we were told we were not doing it the right way. We were supposed to have gender committees. It was the men who told us we were not doing it the right way. That's another story. That was another, debate, I would say. But in the women's committees, we needed those for particular purposes. We needed them, firstly, to develop women's demands, so that women were not just toying for demands that had been set by the men. We needed to develop women leadership. And that's a complicated issue. Firstly, you have to overcome male incumbency, because much as the men say we want women leaders, wait for elections, comrades, and are they prepared to step aside for women leaders? And so basically you get a lot of resistance, driven by male incumbents. So we see this phenomenon in the trade unions of one woman in the top 5 or 6. And when we get really good, we get 2 women. And then when finally women get elected, and you examine the situation, you find actually it's a collapsing organization, and it's no longer so attractive to the male leadership. So the woman, as the woman president of StreetNet said recently, it's so sad when women get brought in to rescue Titanics. And that's in fact, what we see. Then it also means having to find out what makes women not to be interested in standing for election, and really finding out what are all the different things. We all have a list of issues, but to find out in our own organization, what is stopping women from standing and what's making them to vote for men all the time. That's like a micro task that needs to be done in every organization, so that we find out what the issues are in our organization, then we actually have to address them. And it sometimes means having to do all sorts of things that you never thought were revolutionary tasks, like going and meet with the family of the comrade to try and support her in undermining the patriarchal dynamics that she's experiencing at home, and get her family to support her as a worker, if that's her particular issue. The times that we have meetings, etc. All of those issues. I don't think I have to list them again. And then, supporting women to confront the patriarchal obstacles in their families. And there are ways that we can support each other. Certainly in the unions, we had to go and visit many husbands, be very nice to them, meet many chiefs, talk to them with our eyes looking at the floor, to convince them of the importance of, supporting the women, and instead of bashing them, when they became too busy in their revolutionary work. And then also, it's extremely important in workers' organizations to develop women negotiators. This thing of sending the women to the gender workshops and the men to the collective bargaining workshops is definitely a no-no, because women negotiators become powerful by being the people that members approach when they need help. And when members approach them when they need help, it increases their respect for them, it increases their leadership role. That's what makes them to be leaders. So we need to develop women negotiators and not have a glass ceiling of gender desk officer for women. And then once they are negotiators in their sectors, they need to start tackling the gender division of labor in whatever sector they happen to be working with. This applies to the public sector as well as the private sector, which are structured sectors. I'm going to come to the informal in a minute because it's less structured, and some of these dynamics are slightly different, and women do have a little bit more control there. And then it's also necessary for women in the women's groups to collectively strategize on how to tackle the patriarchal internal organizational dynamics. Even though this often threatens the incumbent leadership, it's something that needs to be done if there's seriousness in the organization about developing women leadership. One thing we need to be clear about, I've mentioned that I'm a feminist. There are very different kinds of feminism. I call myself a socialist feminist. There are other kinds of feminism that, I've had very interesting discussions with women that call themselves radical feminists. That's, it's different approaches. But as a socialist feminist, comrades, it's a whole lot more difficult to confront oppression inside your own ranks than it is to confront oppression by the capitalists. It's a big fight to fight the capitalists, but it's a whole lot easier. Everything's much clearer. Confronting it internally is much more nuanced, much more difficult. There's all sorts of reasons why we sometimes don't want to get up people's noses. Some of us don't mind so much getting up people's noses, then people get annoyed with us, whatever, those are the dynamics we have to deal with and collectively develop in our organizations. And men can't drive revolutionary women leadership. Just like I, as a white person, can't drive a Black Lives Matter campaign. I can take a knee together with everybody else, but it would be highly inappropriate for me to drive that campaign. And similarly, women can support us and can ask our advice on what kind of support is needed, but it definitely doesn't involve them driving a women leadership. So that's a challenge. It's a challenge for, revolutionary male comrades who think that women are going off track. And I mean, the tendency is to say, no, comrades, you're not doing it the right way. And there has to be a different way of doing that because that's not appropriate. So it needs a lot of introspection in the organization, and I'm sure we're going to move on to doing a whole lot of that. So, I can remember a case, talking about the trade unions more than 10 years ago, where COSATU was being pressurized to put forward a woman comrade for the governing body of the ILO. So they put forward a comrade, the late comrade Dorothy Mogale, to be their candidate. And they brought her into the ILO one year when there was an election. There was a 3-week International Labour Conference. She was brought in for the 2 days around the elections. She stood for election. She didn't actually have a clue how the ILO works or the International Labour Conference. It was a very, very, embarrassing situation for us women from South Africa, seeing all of this take place. And that's exactly the kind of thing to absolutely avoid. And then, so basically, it's important if we talk about, organizing women workers for socialism. Obviously, putting workers at the center of the revolution is extremely important. But then it means one has to decide in the organization, and I think that's what's facing the SACP at the moment. How can that best be taken up by the incumbent leadership, given the kind of statistics we heard about earlier? Now, when we come to the informal economy, it's not an accident that women have led the movement of organizing in the informal economy. SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, which is our great, pioneering grandmother in the sector. We all learned from them. Sewa started when Ahmedabad, which is a textile producing town in India, it's like the Manchester of India, the textile industry collapsed. All the textile workers had been men in that case. They all lost their jobs. What happened when the men lost their jobs? In order that the children could eat, the women had to find a way to work. And so they went into the streets. They acted as home-based workers, rolling biddies. They went to do vegetable vending and so on. And the women's department of the Textile Labor Association of Gujarat had a very dynamic woman called Ela Bhatt as the leader. And she basically organized those women into a different new kind of an organization. She ended up, annoying the male leadership. They ended up throwing her out. She ended up forming a very famous organization, SEVA, which now has more than 2 million members. It's a women's union in the informal economy. Obviously, they developed new ways of organizing. They did everything differently. But following on the SEVA story, there have been many other women initiatives that have taken the role of organizing workers in the informal economy. In Senegal, the Women's Committee of the CNTS, the Confédération des Travailleurs du Sénégal, they were given the political responsibility of organizing women in the informal economy, and they still lead the responsibility in the CNTS of organizing in the informal economy. In the DRC, there's a work called the Ligue pour la Défense pour les Femmes Congolaises, the League of Defense of Congolese Women. And that's a former trade unionist who formed a women's organization who's now sort of taken a leading role too. So because women predominate in all kinds of precarious and informal work in the gendered division of labor that we have, in many cases, they have to take over when men lose formal work, just like what happened in India. In other cases, they drive family businesses. They bring the guys in with them. And of course, those family businesses have their own patriarchal dynamics, which are less easily defined by traditional Marxist analysis, because it's a phenomenon which has become better understood more recently. So street trader organizations, which, when we came into this business, were characterized by women with organizations with predominantly women as members, and then like 80% women leaders, and then leadership 100% men. Some of our women dominated unions have the same characteristic. So in the street vendors organizations, which became the sector that I worked in mostly, we developed strong women leadership following the example of SEVA, noticing the importance of developing women leadership from the sector, not from academics and NGO people and so on, but from the sector. We used the quota. Now, you know what happened to the debate about quota in our trade unions. It never saw the light of day. But one of the reasons for that, comrades, is because the meetings which make the decisions about these issues are male-dominated decision-making structures. So you can just never get past them because you're always sitting in male-dominated decision-making structures. I always think about that debate we had in the ANC, women in the ANC in 1991 about the women's quota, which we actually lost at that particular Congress, but we won it in the longer term. That's where people like Comrade Tenji and others showed me the ropes and how to do these things in an organization. And I have to say, I was able to use those lessons, in organizations like StreetNet and the street trade organizations, because street traders are a mixed sector. In the majority of countries in the world, other than South Asia, which for various reasons, the gender division of labor has got a different proportion. It's usually women who predominate. We found that the quota, when strictly applied, worked, to be honest. And we found that that it was the best way of avoiding ever, we started an organization from scratch. We avoided ever having a male-dominated decision-making structure. Right from the early meetings where we were planning to set up the organization, we made sure we always had a majority of women, or at least half women, in those decision-making structures. And I can tell you, having half or more than half women in those structures helps those decisions a hell of a lot. And, you know, we were able to achieve that. StreetNet ended up having a 50% quota. The South African Informal Traders Alliance, which was eventually established in 2013, interestingly has a 60% gender quota. Now, while we were forming those organizations, every single time we re-workshopped the constitutions, this would be raised by somebody who would have an objection. There would be a long discussion again. We would have this discussion many times over, but in the end, because we had an equal number of men and women in the room, or more women, we always ended up, you know, agreeing with the original decision. When we had the launch of StreetNet, we had some strong male leadership from Zambia who said they were not ready for a 50% quota, which was in the draft constitution. They would be much more ready for 30%, and they felt it would be more appropriate to start with 30% and later on move to the 50%. So the debate started again. This constitution had been workshopped many times, but the debate started again. And then one of the women from West Africa got up and said she actually completely agrees that 50% is completely unsuitable. In fact, in their countries, she was from Senegal, at least 80% of the people in the sector are women. So they think we should have an 80% quota. So comrades, you can't believe how quickly those guys started to push the 50%. And then we ended up having the 50% quota because they were so terrified we would end up with an 80% quota. So that obviously helps. It helps because then we also found that in our first Congress in 2004, we, for a 15-member council, where we had to have at least 8 women, there were only 5 nominations from women. So the guys thought they would just take up the extra 3 spaces. Then they discovered it doesn't work like that. They couldn't take those spaces. There had to be a co-option done for those other 3 places. After that, there was never a shortage of nominations from women candidates. In the whole history of StreetNet, which has been having congresses every 3 years, right up until last year, 2019, when it finally, despite the quota, got its first woman president. And the first woman president came after a string of highly incompetent male presidents. So even despite that incompetence, they were being elected. But, you know, with the maturity of the organization, there's now a woman president. She's far more competent than the male presidents. But those male presidents used to be very ably supported by their women vice presidents, who were normally much more impressive than they were. And interestingly, the same thing has happened in SAITA, in South African Informal Traders Alliance. The first president elected was a man. The vice president then had to be a woman. That man didn't glory himself very much. He eventually got removed. Then his vice president took over. His vice president was much more competent, and she's now actually the president, because I think she's done two terms as president. And the organization has really moved from strength to strength under the women leadership. So the issue then is the empowerment of the women leadership. And that usually happens on the job. You can't have this issue of saying the women have to be trained as if the men didn't also need to be trained. But the empowerment in the informal economy, it happens on the job. It's a sector which is newly coming into trade union organizing and so on. And you can't sort of wait until everybody's fully trained. I mean, who's fully trained? So you do it on the job. And this has led to strong women leadership. In Johannesburg, we struggled to get the street trade organizations to unify for years. And even when SAITA was formed, Joburg wasn't ready yet. The organizations were all fighting with each other. And we had all these male prima donnas who, you know, wanted to be leaders. And as a result, they missed the boat when it came to the formation of SAITA. And finally, the women got impatient. And there's a woman who, got mad one day and she kept on complaining, and we said, no, comrade, go and organize. And she actually did. And she's managed to get all the Joburg organizations together in a platform called the Joburg Informal Traders Platform. And she's worked wonders. She's worked something that I wasn't able to do, and other people weren't able to do. And everybody complains to me that she's a bit of a bully. She's very bossy. And I've said to them, well, how far would you have got if she wasn't, a bully and bossy? So sometimes we have to behave like that if we want to get there. But, that organization also now it's been recognized by authorities and so on, and it's really getting to places. So the challenge then, and then, of course, when you have strong women leaders, you sometimes wish that you had never built them up, because when the strong women leaders start fighting with each other and clashing with each other, and you're in some kind of a role that you're supposed to be, building a strong organization, you wish you hadn't made them so strong. But it's still a whole lot better than leading a whole lot of compliant women by the nose. Because once women start fighting with each other, of course, it's like when the men fight each other. But in the long run, as the organizations mature, that's part of what happens when you build up leadership from sectors of the population where people were not having leadership before. In West Africa, we, in an international setup that we had in StreetNet, we had the interesting experience of seeing what happens with countries where they have traditional matriarchal cultural structures. Most of those coastal West African countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, and so on, had those matriarchal structures. And because the informal economy isn't as regulated as the industrial sector came in with colonialism, very patriarchal. But because it hadn't been as contaminated, those examples didn't contaminate that sector so much. In the matriarchal cultures, those women in that society, they dominated the markets, they ran the markets. And the structure that you have in West African markets now, with female item heads, like the banana queen and the yam queen and so on, that person she's a tribal leader in the culture, plus she manages that product right from production all the way through to marketing, and she'll manage it in the markets in all of that town. So she manages the whole value chain. So we came to experience that kind of women leadership, and I have to tell you, it's very formidable to meet them. And also when those guys start fighting, it's like really a problem. And everybody fears them. Politicians fear them, trade unionists fear them. But it's an advantage to the informal economy, because those kind of leaders became part of the women leadership of the informal economy in West Africa. We also found in places like Vietnam, where there was a very, very well-organized, grassroots-based mass women's organization called the Vietnam Women's Union. Vietnam Women's Union is not actually a trade union, it's actually a women's mass organization. But we found that the relationship between the Vietnam Women's Union and the Vietnam General Council of Labor, which had started provincial organizations of informal economy workers, they then, when it came to organize women workers, they worked very closely with that Vietnam Women's Union. So it was quite an interesting sort of a model which we hadn't seen before. But when we had to work in Vietnam, it was really helpful to work in that context. But even with these, victories of being able to build up women leadership, even when you've been able to work like a dog for 20 years and build up really good women's leadership, everything can be reversed faster than it was built. And you can never actually take a rest. StreetNet nearly got torn to pieces in 2007 over men interfering with women in order to manipulate who got elected, and the organization nearly collapsed. You'll find all of a sudden, with in country level, somebody will send you an email, a harmless-looking email saying, "We've changed the email address. This is now the new email address." And then you smell something funny. When you look at what's happening, you realize, okay, that email address you've told not to be used happens to be the women leaders' email address. And the one that you've been told to use from now onwards is the guy's address. And what we discovered is like 4 different Latin American countries, the male leadership had surreptitiously replaced strong women in their organizations because the organization had a quota. They couldn't replace them with men. So what did they do? They brought in their wives and their girlfriends and put them in there. And we discovered this when they, unfortunately for them, weren't very smart about their strategy, came to congresses and said, oh, you can let us share a room because we are married. And that's when we started to really understand what was going on, that people had, replaced them with their wives and girlfriends. These are very like subtle things that happen, and you don't always notice it, especially, in an international organization. Or you'll find that, a democratic leadership change happens, a women's leadership, a woman leader who's become too, bossy or dictatorial or whatever gets removed. She gets replaced by guys. In StreetNet, we've had 2 examples of that, in Liberia and in Benin. Those men who wanted to replace those women, and they were women who'd become very, very high level in the organization. They were now international leaders. So of course, once they got replaced in their countries, they couldn't be international leaders anymore because the democratic structures don't elect individuals. They elect people who have a mandate. Those guys didn't realize they were not going to step into those women's international positions. They could step into their local positions, but then other people were going to be elected. And those 2 organizations have actually collapsed, to be honest. And it's going to take a long time to rebuild them up. One of those women then got recognized by the federation that her unit belonged to, and she's now the general secretary of the federation, having been trained during the course of being in StreetNet. So it's never a waste to train women leaders, because even if they get toppled in their own organizations, they've been known by then, and they move on. And they still play a revolutionary role. And that's what we see happening there. So basically, comrades, I wanted to then come down to, okay. So to end off, looking at, what are the key issues then, for us in the SACP? I think these examples of organization of women in trade unions, including membership-based organizations of workers in the informal economy, whether or not they're registered as trade unions, are very key lessons for us to use in the party. So, I think our tasks, the way that I would see it are, one is that we need to overturn the gender division of labor in the economy generally. That's the first revolutionary task. The other revolutionary task is to promote the value of the work which is done by women. I think we've made a start on that. The issue of recognizing the value of unpaid care work that Comrade Geraldine was talking about, that people like Debbie Budlander and so on, feminist economists like Debbie Budlander, have helped us to measure, that unpaid economy, so that we don't treat it as valueless, which has been half the problem half the time. And then the work done by women in the informal economy. And we still find trade unions saying, oh, that's not a proper job. We can't recognize that as a proper job. It might be true that the conditions are that there's a deficit of decent work in that job. But when you say that the work that a woman is doing is not a proper job, that's the most humiliating, degrading thing you can say. And half of the time, the people in the informal economy, women and men, doing jobs that people look down on, people like waste pickers and so on, they get called scavengers and names like that. Half the thing is for them to demand respect for the work they do, even if there's a deficit of decent work, but the dignity of their labor, and to work towards better conditions. So we need to, I think, educate our trade union comrades to stop using this kind of language that is not a proper job. When you see somebody doing something in order to earn an honest living, and they have bad conditions under which they work. We all want to improve those conditions, but it's not fine to say it's not a proper job or it's not proper work. So then we need to work, we need to recognize independent worker organizations that are led by women, irrespective of what form they take. We've seen that new kinds of forms of organization have been very important. Seva in India fought for many years before they got the recognition that they have now. And they've surpassed everybody else when it comes to membership and so on. And then we need to, really tackle the issue of developing genuine women leadership, not the kind of token women leadership that we've seen a lot for the sake of the numbers. So as comrades have been saying, the SACP does have a long way to go on this. It's really a big task for us. I think we need to strengthen the personal is political practices that we've started to, see, the whole movement against GBV and so on is part of that. But in all sorts of ways, we have to strengthen that. Obviously, we have to continue to confront each other very frankly and have very robust interchanges in order to assist each other on this, even if we have to not speak to each other for a week after a bad interchange. And then what I would suggest, there was something we did once in a very male-dominated union in Zimbabwe, where they couldn't understand why the women were not joining. We did a very successful, instead of having a workshop, we did a survey where we got 3 women leaders to go around to all the factories. It was the electricity union in Zimbabwe, to go and survey the women, to find out from them, what are the issues you'd like to see on the table from the union? And then secondly, why don't you stand for leadership positions? And the women were so amazed that the union was actually interested to know what they thought, that they came in numbers to the union. They put their issues onto the table. They were doing different kinds of work from what the male workers were doing. But then also, once they put their issues on the table, they put a woman negotiator as head of the negotiating team, so that the issues started to be mainstreamed when it came to collective bargaining. And I think we should maybe, do that kind of a survey in the SACP. The kind of questions I think we should find out from all our female members is, what are the issues that are most important to you? Why are you in the SACP? What do you think is important, et cetera, et cetera? Try to, understand that better. And then find out from the female comrades what makes them to vote for male comrades, if that's what they're doing. Find out from them what that makes them not to consider taking up leadership positions themselves. I think a survey like that could help us a lot. And I know you're going to be talking about this in the next session, and I might not be with you anymore. But I think a survey like that could be helpful. And then, have a women's leaderships campaign where we do the positive discrimination tactics that you always have to do and so on. Every time there's going to be an election, run the campaign so that you have more and more women coming up from all the different levels. It can't only be at the top level. It's got to be right from the bottom level, because if you have a woman at the top and she disappears, then often there's nothing to replace her with. And we've also seen that being a problem. And then, once we have those kind of campaigns of electing more women leaders, maybe see what is the kind of training on the job that we need to do. And that's also something that we need to listen very carefully to all the women comrades as to what are the things that people need. The other issue that Comrade Geraldine mentioned, and I know that I've skipped it somehow, one of the challenges that we have, we've understood the female division of labor with the formal economy, the informal economy, the traditional informal economy. But now we've got new forms of work coming up. We've got the 4th Industrial Revolution. And we're finding that some of the new forms of work that are accessible to ordinary people, they're kind of being dominated by men. And I can only assume that it's because it's been easier for young men and boys to master the digital technology. So we need to basically look at skills development with women and girls on digital technology to basically change the gender division of labor in the new forms of work that are coming up. And we need to pay attention to those new forms of work. They're starting to be organized in the informal economy organizations, like the Uber drivers and the Uber Eats drivers. They call them entregadores In Brazil, for example, there's even a name for them, and they've been organizing alongside the informal workers. And some of the unions have started to pick up on this issue. That's like the work of the future, but we need to make sure that we are bringing more girls into this. And the issue of getting more girls to have driver's licenses, because to be an Uber driver, really, the only thing you need is the driver's license, and we don't have enough girls that have those. So those are the kind of hard skills that we need to look at to bring women into that, to tackle the gender division of labor that I was talking about before. So comrades, let me stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Comrade Pat. That's a fountain of knowledge. It's really in line with the theme of this